You're listening to the Inside Commerce podcast hosted by experienced consultants James Gerd and Paul Rogers. Inside Commerce is your fast track to digital knowledge, featuring interviews with leading e-commerce retailers, industry thought leaders, and the C-suite of key tech companies to explore the latest in digital strategy, customer experience, and tech. Discover what the latest trends really mean and get practical advice based on experience to help fine-tune your e-com strategy and tech stack. Follow us on LinkedIn and reach out to James or Paul if you'd like to discuss an e-commerce project. We hope you enjoy the latest episode. Today's episode is sponsored by Centre & Greben. More about them later. We are focusing on return strategy, process and technology. And you might be thinking, oh, why another discussion about returns? But this is an important one because we're looking at the context of why returns are how they are and how return strategy is evolving and where the market's going. I think this is really important because there is a bit of a seismic change at the moment and retailers starting to change their behaviour. You've had big retailers recently like of ASOS coming out and announcing obviously that they're going to start charging for returns and various reactions from customers. So the market's changing, the technology is evolving, and we want to talk about what this means for e-commerce and retail specifically. So just a little bit of a context setter, I guess, is where we've got to is that major retailers shape customer perceptions. And for a long time, big retailers like Amazon have had extended returns options like 30-day policy, more than 14-day statutory rights. You've had major brands like Zappos, who launched from ground up of 365 all year round, free returns. So a lot of big retailers have established an expectation that returns should be free, which is translated into customer belief that they should be offered free returns. So good intentions, but misguided because returns is a cost and returns is seen as a policy by a lot of businesses. So policies are seen as costs, not as services and not as potential ways of improving like the overall customer experience. So historically, people have seen the need to mimic free returns, but at the same point treating it internally as a policy. And that's led to not always optimal solutions for the customer, which when you then drop the news that you're going to start charging for returns can often lead to frustration. So what we're going to try and unpick is policy versus service, where the market's headed, and also what are the implications of this current evolution of returns. Paul, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, so I think returns is an interesting point. I think the biggest thing that I would say and the biggest thing that I've noticed over the years is for the average brand, optimizing the returns experience and also, attacking the returns problem is actually really complicated because you've got multiple departments, multiple technologies involved, multiple vendors. And I think a lot of our clients that are smaller have really struggled to even understand the impact of returns on the business and on their kind of net margin. I think when you're working with larger businesses, they're probably slightly more aware. And I think ASOS quite famously did a lot of analysis a few years ago and understood that because essentially their model was like based on cost per new customer, blah, 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 ultimately become profitable. But then they realized that the return rate and the number of people doing multiple returns, and essentially they were losing money on X% of new customers. And that was a big part of their transformation project. And they invested a lot in understanding that. But I still think even achieving that, understanding the cost to the business of returns, both new and return, and I think is still really challenging. There's been a few vendors that have tried to achieve it. But yeah, overall, I think, is still a really challenging area. I think the front end side is quite simple, and, presenting different options and providing better RMA flows. I think that side is pretty simple and a lot of vendors do that really well. But actually then handling the back end side of that, editing orders, preventing certain situations from happening, etc., is then a bit more complicated. And then I think the other thing that we talked about briefly before this is I see a lot of people say, right, we started charging for returns and there's no impact. But I think the real impact of charging for returns isn't on the first purchase or even the next purchase. It's the purchase after that, because essentially a customer completes a purchase, pays to return it and then they're less likely to return again. But that is quite hard to measure, and it would take a long time to measure. So yeah, I think that's kind of why returns is challenging when you look at it at the level that you've certainly looked at it based on the notes that we've got here, just because it is a lot more complicated than people make out.
Grebben create digital flagship stores for iconic brands of today and tomorrow. We are the #1 Centra agency in the world, with more than 50 Centra implementations to date. We are also e-commerce design specialists, platform and tech partner agnostic. Try our new e-commerce design subscription. Visit grebben.com.
Yeah, and I think for me, there is a pivot moment here of stopping seeing returns as a policy and a compliance requirement and seeing it as a customer service, because that totally changes the thinking, the outlook. In the same way that delivery evolved to being a service, like how can we make life easier? How can we remove friction from the customer journey? And this is where I think the leading retailers have started to move. Others are following, and this is about, okay, how do we make life easier? So you talk about the front end bit. There are simple things that you can do. Initiate returns online. Offer people like pre-printed returns labels, have a courier. So there are things that you can set up and do, but the next bit is going to be about deciding who is eligible and when, under what criteria, how you communicate this, at what point it's fair to charge people, when it's not, and how do you actually ensure that the quality of the return service is good enough that people, when they're paying for it, perceive that they're actually paying for a service and they're not being penalised. And I think that's the key thing, because I don't believe that for a lot of the people who are obviously going to start charging outside of the major brands, that this has been thought through in terms of the customer experience piece yet.
Completely agree. And I think the other thing is, when you do charge, and you kind of alluded to it there, I think communicating like why as well. And like because like some of our clients, if you know, like had like a sustainability angle within it and stuff like that. And I think you're obviously going to have different reasons, and in 99% of cases it's going to be margin related. But I think if you communicate like the why and communicate it well, I think it, like you said, has less of an impact. The one thing I would say as well, which I'm not sure we actually touch on here, but whenever we've had, you mentioned about it being a friction point, but whenever we've had clients do really deep analysis of like NPS feedback, like true NPS, returns is always a major feedback area. So I think if you've got someone, if you're hiring a head of customer experience, which very few brands have, like a really experienced person with deep experience in this area, I think they would be going straight to returns and looking at how they could improve the experience for a customer, like new and returning. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, actually, because delivering shipping is typically seen from an acquisition lens, and therefore it gets more attention because it's very easy to get excited about acquiring new customers, because that's direct revenue, and isn't that great? And we'll monetize them as well in retention strategies. But returns is then the loss of some of those. And if your returns isn't managed, as you said, because reporting is often quite fragmented in return space, you could be understating that loss, and therefore your true cost of acquisition is actually significantly higher when you factor in returns. And this is why it's really nuanced. And I think it'd be worth us pointing out some of the issues created by a poorly managed return strategy, because some I think are obvious, but they're worth emphasizing, and others are less obvious and people I don't think necessarily have such a strong handle on. But let's start going through those, because there are some key business impacts of not understanding the data.
Yeah, so I think the first one, and I will add that as always, you've done almost all of the work in the background in terms of the show notes for this. But the first one is the cost to the business of returns, so cost of additional postage, cost of processing the items, refunds to customers. So they would be the line items against the business.
Centra is the only commerce platform built exclusively for fashion brands. Over 300 fashion brands run on Centra, including icons like Paul Smith, Jeff, Avenue, and Nudie Jeans. Centra solves business logic challenges for fashion brands like no other platform, and they are on a mission to help you scale up rapidly, globally, across all online and offline channels. Take your fashion brand global, faster, further, stronger today. Yeah, and the one I don't think is talked about enough. Certainly, when I talk to businesses about like returns as part of that wider, whether it's systemic or whether it's about the end-to-end user journey piece, is the fraud bit and techniques that are taken to minimize fraud. So fraud is often couched in terms of payment processing, right? We have fraud controls in our Stripe, in Shopify Payments, or we've got Signify. But returns fraud exists. And I read something from the National Retail Federation in the US where apparently fraud last year was 11% of transactions, e-com. That's big. And in some verticals, it's way higher than others. So basically, if policy isn't monitored and guardrails are in place to prevent exploitation, you find bad actors, test it, find it works, and then we'll just accelerate that. So a good example would be empty boxing, where somebody orders and they check how quickly like a refund is placed. Some businesses refund instantly. You then send it back. They empty box it and they send a box of no goods in, checking whether the supply chain is accurate enough for the item to get back, to be properly receipted, to be scanned, to be assessed, to be quality controlled, and that flow come back. And when they find that this doesn't happen, then they just start accelerating and placing more orders and taking advantage. So that's one example where actually it's not just about being able to process a return. It's about being able to make sure that the return is a genuine one, basically.
Yeah, I actually was speaking to someone recently about this, and I had no idea how big that was. And also people saying items are broken, and like that being a level of fraud. And then the other one, which again, we could do an episode on this, to be honest, if we got the right guest. But the other one that I had no idea was so big, and I think is like the fastest growing area of fraud, is people choosing the right option when they're not in, and then basically saying the delivery never arrived, which apparently is happening more and more, and having a big impact. The other one that I was going to add to this as well in terms of the cost of the business, I think one of the biggest ones that I see come up, because obviously the bigger side of our business is paid, but it comes up pretty regularly, is when you either have a sudden increase in returns or, periods where you have a lot more returns, and you've got a model for acquiring customers in terms of making sure that it's profitable across different levels of the catalog, across different types of customers, different products, etc. And then you're not factoring in for a potential increase in returns, or just the return rate generally. So I think that's often, and there's been some high profile cases where people have basically thought that they're acquiring customers profitably, but then when they come to, and we've just talked about it a little bit, so when they factor in the impact of returns, actually it's not profitable, basically.
Yeah, definitely. And this is about data visibility and about tracking the true impact of returns. And this often isn't done. And coming with that, I guess that fraud one that you kind of just built on, one of the areas that always surprises me that isn't exploited more is so many delivery companies, whether it's Amazon Prime deliveries or it's DPDs, if there's not a response on the door, will leave it by like the front door and they'll take a picture to go, we have delivered it. So yeah, you can obviously invest in delivery services that will not do that. They insist on a physical connection, but they typically cost more. And it's just people are trying to shave pence off of all costs in their business, because at scale that's a massive amount of money. But Christ, is it easy to nick something off someone's doorstep if they're out all day? And therefore it's easy to exploit and claim, no, it's gone. How do you validate that it wasn't stolen? And this is where the data is needed, because if you're able to if you've got the data intelligence that says, okay, this return reason is item stolen, and we've seen this X times in the last X weeks or months from one particular customer, the ability to then put a block on that account from ordering, you've got to have these automated processes, but you can't have it without the data intelligence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think I've actually thought about that. Like I said, I had that conversation and a brand was telling me how much more common it's getting. And I do agree. I think there's, I think it's just an area that's very easy to exploit.
Yes, it is. There is, this is a reality. All the while there are processes, there'll be people out there trying to find loopholes to exploit them. That's just the way it goes. And when a weakness is found, then people do it at scale. Then one other point about data point, actually, about the faulty items, and making sure there's a robust process when items are come back, that they're actually properly audited to know that it was faulty and the customer hasn't just said it was faulty to get it returned, is most businesses do and should have rebates negotiated with suppliers for a certain percentage write-off, knowing that a certain percentage will always be faulty. And that means that a rebate's built into the commercials and you don't have to go through a discussion point with your supplier to get that money back. But you might find your rebate's undercooked. If the fault rate's higher than the rebate allows for, you're losing money. So you need to basically be ensuring you're tracking this data and renegotiating constantly with suppliers, and also pushing back. If one supplier, and you might have different suppliers for the same product as well, if one supplier's fault rate is far higher, then maybe you've got a supplier issue that's contributing to your returns rate that you should be tackling head on. What else in terms of like the commercial issues and why this needs to be taken more seriously?
So another point that you've put here that we've already touched on a little bit is just that impact on repeat purchase. And yeah, I do think, again, when I have worked with more mature businesses where they've had someone that's really analysing the data or impacting, or like the impact of a bad returns experience, it does impact the lifetime value of that customer or the likelihood of them repeat purchasing. So I think that, to me, that, and then the margin impact of those, points from the first point, I think are the biggest one.
Yeah, exactly. And also, if you have just a generic returns policy, which is a lot of simple ones are, you send it back to us, we give you a refund after we've got the item back. That's the most basic level for e-com who don't have system sophistication or the teams to manage it. The problem with that is some of your margins on a product are so small, especially when you're in high discount land, that returning doesn't always make sense. And you've seen more and more brands, especially those with sustainability at their heart, who are trying to reduce like the carbon footprint of this process of saying, well, actually, it is better that you keep this item. You can give it away. Can you just take it to a recycling centre? It's more environmentally ethical and also better cost all round, rather than you arranging a courier, send it back to us receiving it in a warehouse, us then taking it somewhere else to dispose. So you've also got to think about the use cases for when you should and shouldn't be getting items returns back to you. Next big question. Why don't you go first on this? Because I think this is an area where there isn't a clear definition, and retailers are really trying to find the balancing point. Is what does fair usage mean in the context of this is where it's going to, right? Fair usage. You can get free returns or access to our standard return service if it's fair usage, but if it's not fair usage, then we start to charge.
Yeah, so I think, and again, I think ASOS were quite, was it ASOS? I think it was ASOS that, and they were working with, I believe, a third party based in Sweden for this project. They did a piece where they essentially just analysed a lot more of this at customer level. And essentially the fair usage policy, I think, was like free returns for the first return. And then basically you would get more, like you would get more of an allowance essentially as you purchase more without returning. And then essentially at a customer level, it was like, yeah, you then had a policy. And I guess that's probably where it will go over time. And I think, AI will help to do that. I think the vendors continuing to improve around the data side would definitely help with that. But I guess that's the holy grail, where you offer a free return in one scenario, but as a customer then, becomes a repeat offender or becomes less profitable or has an impact on margin, you then start to charge for returns. And I think was it ASOS that started blocking customers as well, I think? They were banning customers based on returns activity. Yeah,
and actually it originated out of the US. Some of the big department stores out there were some of the most high profile ones a couple of years back to start doing it. That's when it started we got the winds across the ocean to us about there, and the initial reaction was, we shouldn't be doing that. Yeah. But fundamentally, when you pull this back to returns as a service, it's not a right. It's a statutory right from you have the right to return a faulty or unused product, but you don't have the right to just order loads of stuff and return whatever you want and not have to bear any responsibility for it. It's crazy. So yeah, I think repositioning it as a service changes perspective. When you look at it as a cost cost line to the business, what impact it has on profitability. You have to have fair usage. And I'm actually really behind this. I don't have as a consumer, I do not have an issue with it. A person is having to take effort to pick and pack something, send it to me. That's why I pay shipping. If I don't want it now, somebody's got to take the effort to get that back. And if I don't want to pay for a courier, if I refuse to go, I don't want to order a courier and pay for a courier, why should I expect somebody else to do that for me free of charge? Especially if I've ordered 5 items because I wasn't sure which one I most wanted.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. I mean, it's got to come down to how do you make a service that is transparent to the consumer and isn't punishing them unfairly? And that's what fair usage has got to mean, is you're not punished for returning, but you understand the implications of a return depending on the reason for you returning that item.
I think to your point, you've already made a couple of times as well. So one around the wardrobing concept where you order multiple sizes, multiple colors, and then return the ones you don't like. And also how you approach the low margin point. I think there's no one size fits all solution here. I think that's probably the big message. I think so your wardrobing point reminded me of how some of our clients have used Harper. They're selling items that are, £1,000 AOV, encouraging someone in London in particular to use Harper essentially gives them certain benefits around the experience, certain benefits from a data perspective, and then also means that service agent can then take back the other sizes, and it's essentially addressing this on some level. And I guess it's like in the luxury segment, there probably will be different options of how you could maybe address this with more of an in-person component. But when you're dealing with more volume, then you probably need a completely different policy basically.
Yeah, exactly. And the policy's got to be nuanced, hasn't it? Because you've got brands like Nudie Jeans and Polly who have free returns in store. So if you're a stores and online retailer, this makes perfect sense if you've got a good store base. Now, if you're a D2C brand that's got 2 stores, one in London, one in Manchester, then offering free returns in store appeals to a very, very limited metropolitan base, unfortunately. So if you've got decent store coverage, that's actually really good, because then you can say, hey, look, we give you a free return, but if you want to send it to us and don't want to come to store, then there is a charge for that unless it's damaged. So I think you're right. It's not one size fits all. It's got to be nuanced. But I think the key message here is it's got to be thought through in terms of how it lands to the customer.
Like that return in store point as well. So Doc Martens have just rolled this out recently. I think obviously it can be complex from like an operations perspective at like the big scale. But almost all of the multi-channel brands we work with have found that getting a customer into store is high value, and they're more likely to buy something else. And like you say as well, all the way through this, they'll have a better experience. So I think, completely agree. I think that's a really good strategy. It's just that you'll probably only ever get a small proportion of customers doing it, but it is a really good point.
Yeah, exactly. And the I think this blends in nicely to the next point we want to discuss, which is like the key techniques to reduce the impact returns and improve or reduce the cost impact, I think, as well. So how can you minimize the damage? Because you'll always have returns. There will always be cost. You will not be able to offset all of the cost through income. I think accepting that and building that into your overall profit and loss stuff is really important. But the free returns in stores is one mitigation. I really like the way that brands like Nudie offer free repairs, because one of the big things is you've got an item, you know that if it's got a warranty period, and that warranty period varies from product to product and brand to brand. But if something happens and that product is substandard and it tears, for example, and I had this with a North Face jacket, and I looked at it, and North Face do repairs. Repairs out of warranty are quite expensive, but Nudie offer free repairs for life. Now, what a great way that is. And again, you've got to bring it in. You've got to take it to a repair store, and they're not everywhere. But I think that's a really good thing. Like, what services can you provide around it where you can actually keep and maintain a product longer so that it's not sent back, where you don't have to refund it, and the customer then perceives a probably greater value, and it only suits certain products. What else are you obviously speak to a lot of different brands around stuff like this. what are you seeing? Like, where are people focused? What are people really trying to do? And where are you advising they focus to help reduce returns demand?
Yeah, sorry, I'll answer that in a second. I think your point on returns as well, repairs, I think is a really interesting one, because the overhead of that now is so much lower than it would have been 3 years ago. There's so many third parties that will essentially own this for you. You partner with them, and they will come and collect the product, etc. They will do the repair, they'll return it, and essentially you just educate them and give them the information, etc. And the cost is relatively low. And again, going back to that experience point, like, it's such a positive experience. If you've got an item that might have, need repair either straight away and you might take the hit, or further down the line, and even if you charge the customer, it's such a good experience. I think we were going to do an episode with Sojo at one point, which we should revisit. So they're the one that a lot of our clients use, but there's so many vendors now in this space, and the overhead is so much lower. I guess the biggest thing for our clients is just trying to prevent a return. And that's there's obviously, I would say that, and then also using vendors. You've mentioned Swap a few times in here, who have obviously been a sponsor to the podcast in the past. Loop is another one our clients use, various others. But I guess that front end experience around the return and in trying to incentivize exchanges and all that would be one. But by far the biggest one would be trying to prevent a return in the first place. And that's just trying to basically surface as much information around size and fit. Again, given that the only thing I would add that I should always caveat is that we're very, very fashion focused. And in that vertical, majority of the returns are going to be size and fit. So just trying to surface as much information around the measurements, trying to surface as much information from real customers around fit, size, as much kind of imagery, content, and just add as much context in those areas. So I'd say that's probably the bit that we're most involved in personally.
Yeah, and we did a podcast last week, which is around 14 examples of brands who are doing standard ecom features just a bit better. Yeah, and one of the ones I liked that you brought out was around better use of product reviews. So not just, did you like it? How much would you rate it? And give us a few words, but actually very specific elements. So Gymshark doing it is one example. There are others as well, where it's, how did this fit? Was it the right length? So getting very specific facets of the product fed back at that product level to be able to then do an assessment of whether there are specific fit issues with particular garments, particular suppliers, etc. I think anything where the data granularity gets deeper is better because you get more intelligence.
Yeah.
The other one that I think is really smart is where instead of like free returns is, you're just going to get it. Being not able to say to people, right, if you just want to send back and get a refund, there's a charge for the return. However, if you're willing to transfer that product to store credit, we won't charge you for that return, because then say you've got a £60 pair of jeans, instead of having to now refund that item, but they pay $3.95 to send it back to you, they're not paying, they keep, you get the item back, and it's in good condition, it can go on for resale, and that 60 quid goes into store credit, which means that they will reuse it on another order, and hopefully you keep them happier, but you keep them within a purchase journey. And that should give you a great chance to turn it into future orders and get the lifetime value up to then recoup the cost of that return.
The next level of that you see a bit in the fast fashion space is, rather than offer you the 60 quid value, because of the margin hit and, the operational hit, they'll actually offer you like 120, 130% the value to further incentivize the store credit or exchange route.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I know I've worked with a few businesses where, from policy level, they've evolved customer service like frameworks to offer store credit for returns out the policy window. So where they've got quite a loyal customer base, they don't want to piss them off, but they don't want to have this endless, like Zappos has, 365 all year round.
Yeah,
you're out of your 30-day window. Fine, we'll accept the return, but it's going into store credit rather than a refund. And once it's been communicated as to why that's happening and the reason, the need to do it, actually it's landed pretty well with customers, because it's communicated clearly and the customer understands that they're not being punished, and that money is there for them to reuse.
Yeah, makes sense.
Let's talk about the key point then, because you raised this when we were planning this episode about the link between return service and loyalty and where this is going, and that free return still fundamentally has a place, but it's judicious use of it. So do you want to talk people through where are you seeing this? What is the link between returns and loyalty?
Yeah, so I think there's a big trend at the moment, both loyalty and just data collection in general. There's a big trend around people being willing to offer free shipping, free returns in exchange for either they'll offer it to loyal customers, which I think makes perfect sense in terms of creating like tangible value and experience value for being a loyal customer, and then trying to continue to push the value of that customer. I think that makes perfect sense. But I would say also to people like Jay Lindbergh, lots of other brands, Solomon, whoever else, basically if you build an account and as part of that account you provide certain data points that they can then push into their CDP and use for personalization and CRM, etc., you will get free shipping and returns. And quite a few of our clients have started doing this or are in the process of doing this at the moment. And to be fair, it does kind of make sense. So I think obviously it's a massive incentive to actually hand over the data or build an account that you might not even really, feel like you're doing too much. But it's just a nicer way to do it as well. But yeah, the other point was building it into your loyalty program. And there's some customers that have gone beyond as well. So like they'll come and collect the item for free. Hugo Boss offer receiptless returns, which I really like. So if you're a certain tier of their loyalty program, you don't need a receipt, you can just return at any point. And there's various other examples of that where it's been pushed a bit harder. But I mean, realistically, with, I guess, loyalty, like you said at the start, it's like you're trying to find those points of friction and turn them into like really great experiences. And it's just another reason to stay loyal to a brand.
Yeah, and I think the key point here is that customers need to be profitable, because if customers aren't profitable, a business goes out of business and it can't then, provide that service anymore. And educating people to understand that, but rewarding them for the more they contribute to your business, it's just absolutely no-brainer, isn't it? Don't punish people for not spending much. And not being a frequent customer, but don't reward them for that as well. Then in the next point, before we come to the roundup of where's this headed, what's the future turns is what's happening in the tech space. So a few things that I've definitely been noticing in terms of where people are focused and where my clients are putting effort is evolving from the basic of, hey, we've got an online form, you can fill out and send it to us, and then somebody will get in contact, is using the modern generation of live chat AI bots to pre-program flows for returns. So Rattenbauer, for example, do this using Certainly, where you've got a standard like pills. It's like, what do you want to do? You can have your standard chat, but I want to initiate return, check order status, pre-program flows, which then enable you to log in or to put in your order number. That gets validated. Then you can send a return request, add the return information. That is pushed through a particular process flow. Where that ends up is obviously where you want it to do. It could be in a customer service queue, it could be to a specific individual. But I think things like that help the customer experience a bit. And what we're trying to do, we said, is like the move towards reducing friction, seeing this as a service. And by doing that, you're providing better tooling, and more people are getting used to this as an easy interaction. And then the second bit built on top of that, I'm actually working with a customer on this at the moment, is whether it's a request form online or whether it's through an AI bot or whatever that mechanism is, that you have a process that automatically pushes that into customer service ticketing solutions. So that automatically generates a ticket with the tag of return, which enables that to be flowed to a specific customer service reps who are responsible for handling returns. I mean, if people in B2B, if you've got assigned specific accounts, and obviously it can put it into your workload as well. But this improves visibility and speed of response because it auto tickets rather than somebody having to go and pick up like an inbox message, then go and create a customer ticket. One brand I work with in food space saw a 50% reduction in their inbound ticket inquiries for like returns information simply by adding that AI live chat thing. So it can have a fundamental impact on team efficiency and how people focus on value add. So that's what I'm seeing in the tech and automation. What have you noticed as like recent trends and developments?
I think you've covered most of it, to be honest. I think the bit that I was going to say is I think it's going to be super interesting to see where this is in 2 years. One, from an AI perspective, and how much more intelligence there'll be behind this, and how much like data sharing that could exist with some of the vendors. And two, how much consolidation we'll see, because you're talking here about integration with live chat and chatbots and stuff like that. It'd be interesting. I mean, if you look at a business like Gorgeous, I guess they're owning more and more of that customer service piece. And more areas around it. Like, does it make sense to them to also offer returns and build that into the flow entirely? So I think it'll be interesting to see. And equally, someone like Loop as well, like they're at a really, big scale, just covering returns, exchanges, some other CX bits. It'll just be interesting to see where all of this goes. And I think the bit that's still missing for me is the data on the impact of returns at different levels. And again, I think AI could definitely solve that. But it's just, where that sits within different vendors and the different parts of the stack.
Yeah, agreed. And I know a lot of businesses where they have a very manual process in the warehouse. So, and that's where the data points fall down. So items come back in, they're not scanned. There isn't an automatic notification that's fed back through via the WMS into whatever back office system, which is then connected to ecom. So at an ecom account level, you typically see the refund, because the refund's often processed in the payment gateway that's connected to the ecom store. So at least you see that at the customer account level, and you see that in your admin backend, but you don't see the return status. Yeah. And therefore you have gaps in knowledge and data. So I agree the data bit's critical. So we're not going to talk about today about the specialist dedicated RMA platforms, likes of like Swap, Narvar, Loop, etc., simply because that we have covered it previously, although probably about a year or so ago. And there's a lot of deep functionality there. We wouldn't be doing it justice if we tried to talk about how those systems are used. But I think let's close this off, which is a summary of where this is heading. So do you want to do what are your points in terms of strategically, where is returns headed in ecom?
Yes, I think I just kind of touched on it there a little bit. I think in terms of data across the whole piece, the other thing that I would say, I think this will all be and has already all been accelerated and will continue to be accelerated as a result of a higher proportion of brands using the same technologies. So be that the third party returns vendors that we've just talked about, be that Shopify, obviously, the same ERP solutions, etc. I think, and also, things like unifying returns reasons. And I just think the data is just getting much cleaner and easier to work with. So I think that will make a lot of this stuff easier, and there'll be a lot more room for automation and intelligence.
Yeah, agreed. And my key points and takeaway, just started this episode with is you should be seeing returns as a service, not a policy. Yes, you've got to have policy in place and it's got to be compliant, but fundamentally this is about the customer experience. And if you don't understand the impact on the customer and the friction that's being created and try and remove that, then fundamentally returns is always going to be seen as a hassle and is going to cause you problems and headaches. That won't go away unless you flip that thinking. Yeah. Paid is the new free. That's my pithy headline grabber. But that doesn't mean that everyone should pay all the time. You have to decide what are the rules for when people pay and what they're not. But you also have to give your customer service team that flexibility to respond and waive for that if there is an important customer or if there's a use case where actually, do you know what, the grief that it will cause by not actually being flexible is not sustainable. And then I think the other thing is just when you are charging, make life easier for the customer. And one good example of this is don't make them pay for it up front. The ideal way is that it's deducted from the cost of the refund. That's one part of a policy of send it back, we'll refund, but we'll take the return fee out. You don't have to pay any extra, don't worry. There are little things that can make this more palatable, basically.
Yeah, agreed on that one for sure. And then, I think the other one for mine is just, it comes back to yours as well. It's like, offering free returns to the right customers rather than people that, have, had high return rates in the past, or even new customers. So trying to think of a reason to justify taking the hit, I guess, on the return.
Yeah, and the other one that we've talked about, but I'm not sure how this will play out, is where the larger retailers have like a delivery subscription service where you pay £10, £20 a year to get free delivery, standard deliveries. Expanding that to now do a additional one where, okay, you take this tier and you get free delivery and returns wrapped up, and you pay us the money, and therefore we know that that's probably going to cover some of the hits to our margin. But I think that's an area that needs a lot more model. And as you say, the data often isn't there for people to do this. Cool. Well, that brings us to the end. I'm sure me and Paul could talk about this for a lot longer, as you can probably tell. It's an area we both feel quite passionately about because it's critical to e-commerce success, margin, and customer happiness. Let us know what you think. Anything in this you disagree with? Anything you think we've missed? What have you learned? What works for you? What does good returns look like? And what tech do you use to help provide the right service to customers? We always love hearing back from everyone else. Hope you found it useful. Until next week, everyone. You're listening to the Inside Commerce podcast, hosted by experienced consultants James Gerd and Paul Rogers. Inside Commerce is your fast track to digital knowledge, featuring interviews with leading e-commerce retailers, industry thought leaders, and the C-suite of key tech companies to explore the latest in digital strategy, customer experience, and tech. Discover what the latest trends really mean and get practical advice based on experience to help fine-tune your e-commerce strategy and tech stack. Follow us on LinkedIn and reach out to James or Paul if you'd like to discuss an e-commerce project. We hope you enjoy the latest episode.